I'm excited about today's show. I'll just say that Aisha Hauser and Patrice Curtis extended regrets, and we'll hopefully be back next week in the unending shuffle of who's there on The View. Today we have three special guests talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in different cities, which I'm really excited about hearing the cross-pollination and what's going on in different places. So from Philadelphia, we have Leslie McFadden. And Leslie, many of us know, started a great Facebook group called RUU Awake that's talking about issues that came out of Ferguson, and just spoke to a huge crowd in Philadelphia on MLK Day. I think we posted that video on the CLF Facebook page. It's pretty exciting. So welcome, Leslie. So glad you could be here.
Thanks for having me.
And then from Minneapolis, we have Lena Gardner. Lena has been working particularly with the people of faith in the Black Lives Matter in Minneapolis and also is a core organizer there. Welcome, Lena. And then finally we have Kenny Wiley. Kenny is the director of faith formation at Prairie UU in the Denver area. And he's an organizer for Coloradoans for Justice. And he's also, Kenny, you came on earlier and talked about the aftermath of Ferguson. We're delighted to have you back. So
it's good to be here again.
Start. I'd love to hear from each of you what's going on where you are. Who wants to start? Kenny, you're up. You want to start?
Sure. Well, thanks, friends, for having me on. As Meg said, I'm in Denver, and what's been happening lately, we had about, I guess, on MLK Day, we had a Black Lives Matter conference that a group that I'm getting more and more involved with, the Denver Freedom Riders, put on, and we had about 1,000 people show up. There's a huge parade, well, we call it the Marade in Denver, and with estimates of 30 to 35,000 people. And after the Marade ended on MLK Day, we had a 1,000-person conference on Black Lives Matter. And
I'm going to be totally ignorant. Why is it a Marade and not a parade?
It's a march plus a parade.
Ah, Marade. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Good word.
Yes, the march plus parade. And so it was, really powerful, and about 200 UUs marched in that, and that was great to march with them. And then there were about 60 UUs who came to the conference, and I facilitated a panel as a part of the conference agenda, and we had breakout sessions, including one on faith-based activism. So that was really uplifting as far as the Black Lives Matter movement in Denver. And then more recently, we've had a really tragic situation where a 17-year-old named Jesse Hernandez was killed by police on Monday morning here in Denver. Jesse did not identify with a gender, but identified was part of the community of Latin descent. And it's very fresh, and it's been tricky here because as in many cities, the quote black community and the Latina community don't exactly get along fully, and that the black community have been on the quote front lines of this movement for several months now, and we're getting in the way, and so that's something that we wouldn't have to go into in detail here, but you asked what's going on, and if I came on the show and didn't mention that we had an event last night where some people were really upset because a lot of black leaders, myself included, were in their mind too much in the fore, and we weren't being good allies. The struggles may be similar, but they're not the same, and so we've got some internal work to do to figure that out. But throughout all of it, the UU presence in Denver has been strong. So even as we have these hard conversations, that's really, in this city, that's really exciting for me and really motivating.
Thanks for that, and that's an area I'd love to pursue later in the show, a little bit about allies and how that's working, because I'm sure it's different in every community. Leslie, want to introduce yourself and say what's going on in Philadelphia?
Absolutely. I kind of wear two hats in the movement. One is obviously I do lots of local work here in Philadelphia, and then the bulk of my time is spent connecting people nationally with each other and resources. So as far as Philadelphia goes, we had a large march on MLK Day. It was put together by a really broad-based coalition of about 70 different organizations between sponsors and endorsers and things like that. And we ended up with around 7,000 people that attended the march. It was a really powerful day of unity. We had three main demand areas that were associated or that we had developed as a part of the march itself under jobs, justice, and education. And so we utilized the route of the march to kind of symbolize those pieces that we were trying to push forth as demands. So we started actually on the steps of the school district here in downtown Philadelphia, and had some remarks there from students, from parents, and kind of a kickoff to get people kind of energized. And the demands around education involve a fully fair funded school system and a democratically elected school board. Philadelphia has been operating without a school board for about 25 years, and it's really been hampering to the work that the students and parents and educators want to do. And the charter school initiative has just decimated. We closed about 46 schools last year. Our actual students went on strike at one point in the middle of the school year last year, so it's a pretty critical area of need for us. And then we took ourselves around City Hall, where we were able to give some voice to the jobs piece, which we are pushing for a $15 an hour minimum wage citywide, and preserving the right for unions to form, which has been an issue in our city, specifically at our airports, where there's been a lot of pushback on people unionizing there, and a lot of low-wage workers in the city have been rallying around this 15 now. They're a very great organization. They've been doing a lot of wonderful work in that area, and they're going to have more coming up in the next couple of months. And then we took the march fully along and ended up right smack in front of Independence Hall, and so the mall itself in front of Independence Hall next to Liberty Bell served as the final spot in our final rally, and we had a number of speakers there, myself included, where we really drove home our justice demands, which have to do with ending stop and frisk completely in the city. And then the second piece is putting together a fully empowered and democratically elected review board, independent review board for our police officers. So as far as what's going on here, that's been a big push. There's been already one meeting post the march, which we are starting to develop what our action item is going to be. Deliverance of the demands have been done to the parties that will be associated with each of them, and now we are putting together what our actions are going to be if and when those demands are not met. So it's been really great to be able to work with a wide cross section.
So are those the demands of the 70 organizations?
Correct, and it was a lot of work.
I bet it was. That's amazing.
Yeah, we started planning the march about 8 weeks ago, so 7 weeks prior to the march. So we did not have a lot of time to put it together, but just had this idea of doing something, and we thought a march would be great. And slowly we had more and more people come to the table, and we all, like you do with anything, you have subcommittees and everybody breaks up, and this is doing PR, these people are doing visuals, these people are doing outreach, and of course we had a demands team, and so they I think had one of the harder tasks in kind of bringing all of these different things. I mean, we had so many demands and things that people want, which we all were in agreement are important, but to distill them down to some critical ones that we all as a group could agree on would help all Philadelphians. I think they did a really good job in doing that, and of course, our goals would be to knock those out this year and move on to some more for next year. So
that'd be great.
It would be, wouldn't it? So yeah, I mean, it was a lot of work to do that, and obviously there's pushback. Everybody doesn't get their specific thing heard, but it definitely worked in terms of getting people together. And I think it really allowed the message of the march to be received really well, not just by those that were there, because you could see, I mean, we had printed up, I think, five or 600 signs that were each of the demands. And so that's all people saw, when they were walking around. We had them carrying it. But, I turned the news on that night, and Jim Gardner, who's our ABC anchor, he's reporting on the march from the anchor desk, and he said, today's march was about justice, and education. And I was like, whoa,
Even the news got it.
Okay, awesome. For us, it was a really big win just to know that the actual message was received and that the demands were the focus of the march. And so that was really great. Obviously, there's always challenges. We had a really great recap meeting just to discuss, what went right, what went wrong, what would we do differently, and moving forward to change those things. And then with my other hat, as far as the national stuff goes, obviously was a lot of activity on MLK Day and MLK weekend. So just updating my site to make sure people knew what was going on in their area, and then specific challenges that came up.
Why don't you say what your site is, as long as you're mentioning?
The site itself is a FergusonResponse.org, or you can just go to FergusonResponse.tumblr.com, which is where all the actions themselves are listed. You can search by date, you can search by location, and this actually the Tumblr site and also the network itself is directly something that came out of my interaction with UU ministers and ministers in the St. Louis area. So
Leslie, just for those who don't know, took a real leadership role in the denomination in the wake of the Ferguson, as we waited for the grand jury to speak, and really did a lot of networking outreach. It was just indispensable. So thank you so much for both of those hats.
I gotta say, I've been on that Ferguson Response site, the Tumblr site and the network site, to keep up with stuff. I had no idea that UUs were connected with that, or that was somebody that I might someday know. I just thought, it came from somewhere, and so I'm really glad to hear that you were doing that. It's a great site. Thanks.
It really is. It's a wonderful site. And Leslie was with us the night that the grand jury spoke, and just had all kinds of great up-to-the-minute information. Hank, before you jump in, I want to have Lena introduce herself. Sure. And I forgot to say, because I take it so for granted, that besides all the work that Lena does with Black Lives Matter, I'm also very proud to say that Lena is on the staff of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. She is our Director of Membership and Fundraising. So, Lena, what's going on in Minneapolis?
Hi, Meg. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on. So I think, our biggest thing, we had a march on MLK Day, Reclaim MLK Day March, and there was about 2,500 people there. So it was pretty successful for us. We have since, I just got off of a wonderful 2 days of time off, and I've learned in that time we've already secured some meetings with the chief of police in Minneapolis and been able to move forward some local demands just in the city of Minneapolis. And I think we're currently working on pulling together a coalition of folks to draft statewide legislation, and this is a long-term strategy. Minnesota, like other places, had a sweep of, our houses, our legislature, and it's pretty conservative. So we don't think we'll be able to move anything at the state level this year, but we're prepping it for next year as well. So we kind of have two dual tracks of some local short-term stuff that is very winnable for us, and some long-term demands that are going to take a long time. So there's that piece of it, and then I think we have a little extra here because we planned this action at the Mall of America, and the city attorney of Bloomington has decided to persecute and go after it's a little random how she came up with the folks she's going after, and she's pursuing charges. So at the same time that we are coming up with actions to move our demands, we're also thinking about actions to tie in to get those charges dismissed, get them dropped, and it's also been a little bit of a blessing in that I don't think anybody would still be talking about the Mall of America action that we did if she wasn't pursuing charges against 10 individuals. So, it's a blessing and it's a challenge. But I think some of the I was approached by somebody from Milwaukee working with a loose coalition of Black Lives Matter, and the issues around identity and who's at the forefront and who's leading and who gets press time is also one that we're struggling with in our group, and who does the die-ins and who gets on the floor. Stuff like that, I think, is coming through in a lot of important ways. It's bringing up a lot of important conversations. Our core organizing group in Minneapolis is mostly Black folks, and then we have just 2 folks who are allies, and so it's a fascinating discussion, and from what I can hear, these issues are happening all over the country from the folks I've talked to. So I think going forward, our next strategy too is to get more organized with the media strategy, because we've kind of had a few losses, we'll say, in the way of the narrative around the media. So we're looking at how to be more strategic and effective there. So.
Thanks, Lena. Yeah, this issue of allies is really interesting to me, and other communities of color. And like, I went to a Black Poets Speak Out event the other night, and the American Sign Language community was there in large numbers, saying the police are terrible to us as well, which is something I'd never even thought about before. That people who can't speak and use motions are also at risk. And so I'm curious for any of you about how you see the movement. I mean, Leslie, you talked about 70 organizations, which I assume is, that really broad-based group. But in terms of the moving forward with the Black Lives Matter specific messaging, how you see allies being of use, different kinds of allied groups. Lena, you're still on if you want to start, because you're still there.
Oh, okay. So I guess one of the things I've repeatedly said, and I actually did when we did a vigil, I preached about that we need everyone in this movement, and I've seen it as a really beautiful opportunity for white allies in particular to step up and push themselves to advocate in ways that they haven't before or have been afraid of before. And I really have been encouraging, like, my white UU folks and other people in my life to try and step up in new ways and do that. And at the same time, I've been encouraging some of the younger Black folks to step up in new ways as well, and really listen to that call for leadership. That includes my own self, and being propelled into a spotlight that I maybe am not so comfortable with yet, but getting there. So, I think it's a really unique opportunity, but we do have to be careful. One example I'll lift up is, so we did a smaller clergy action on MLK Day, and die-in action where the governor of Minnesota was speaking, and our top 3 congresspeople were Al Franken, Amy Klobuchar, and Keith Ellison were all speaking. And the night before there had been a really intensive planning meeting where it was like an hour-and-a-half long discussion of, do our non-Black POC allies get on the floor with us, and so that was a question for us. And if they do get on the floor, how do they identify? And so after kind of a lot of discussion, we had decided we'd like for them to do the die-in, participate in the die-in with the Black bodies on the floor, with a sign that says, like, Latinos for Black Lives Matter, or however they identify. What's really fascinating, and I have to mention that Meg's child, Gia, was a part of this, and what was fascinating to us was that we had, I think, maybe a handful of non-Black POCers who are on the floor with us, but the thing that got the attention of the media, right, the photos were all of Gia and another non-Black POC that they put on the cover. So, it's really hard to navigate these issues, and that's exactly what folks were bringing up, was that it is Black bodies being killed, and so how do we work really carefully with our allies and still make sure things like that don't, or are less likely to happen, of the main photo being non-Black bodies there. So the other thing I should mention is the week before the MLK March, we actually had a shooting of a Black man in St. Paul. And I've been working with the family. And I think for me, that's really grounded me spiritually in a new way in this work. Sitting across from the family of someone who just lost someone to police violence really puts a whole new importance and spin on it for me that I didn't know, and also puts a new importance on some of these identity issues that we're pulling through. And I had the thought of somehow trying to explain to folks that like trying to reconcile the reasons we're here with some parts of ego that folks have a really big vested interest in. And so I don't know how to be more articulate than that about it, but it was something I was reflecting on in my time off. So.
Yeah, that's great. And Kathy had asked about who gets on the floor for die-ins. And Kathy, hopefully that answered your question, at least in part. I'm sure that'll come up again. Kenny, you sort of alluded to this in Denver without, I'm sure that there's a lot of pain in every community about these conversations. But if there's something that you'd like to share with the group about what you're learning from the conversations, it would be useful.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of conversation around ways in which even oppressed groups can accrue privilege, and especially, or at least members of those groups, and especially when I think about when I started doing this work 6 months ago, and how it felt. I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing. I was new. I was just some guy that kind of stepped forward, but 6 months later I go to these rallies and I know half the people by name and 3/4 of them by face, so another fourth by face, I should say. And like it's really hard, because what's important is that as different groups come together, I think within those groups people have to be followers at times. That if we have people who are just always wanting the mic, that are just used to their voice always mattering, even if they're a Black man who's particularly at risk, because a true inclusive movement is one that allows space for new voices to emerge. And so we talk about it in terms of whiteness and white people being used to their voices mattering, and there's been a lot of conversation around that. What I'm interested in now is that conversation, but also ways in which those of us who have had the mic, even if it's just for a few months, can give it up and can say, hey, we have this network where we can turn out 300 people pretty easily. How can we help you? Rather than like, oh no, we got this, right? Because we're the ones leading, and that's so key.
Kenny, I'm curious, are there any age or gender dynamics that you have noticed doing this work?
Yeah. Joanna, a great question as usual. Yes. And there was this, there were a lot of struggles early on with the people who, would say, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and who are you, and where have you been? And I said, well, I was in school, and then I moved here a year ago. I mean, that was a big struggle early on, but I think we had some hard conversations, and so the age stuff is a lot better. That when you're willing to work in community and not demonize the older folks, but say, hey, you're not helping. And we want you there. We want you speaking. We also want you listening. We found that people here are pretty receptive. I'd also say, as far as gender dynamics go, that's a huge problem. I mean, and that goes to that notion of allyship, that yes, as a Black man, I am at risk in ways that others aren't, but it's not just Black men being killed. It's Black people, it's brown people, however they identify, and so I have to recognize that I have privilege as a man, and other men in the movement, we're having some hard conversations. I can only speak for Denver about you got to talk less. Sometimes it's just a matter of space. taking up space on the mic, that yes, we know your voice is deep and great and wonderful, and you need to use it less, and I need to do the same.
Can you come here to have those conversations with people?
Yeah, sure. It's hard. It's hard because we're, in different ways, we're told our voices are so important because of our whiteness, because of our maleness, because of our height, whatever it is, and we gotta, because what happens is that the movement starts perpetuating, it's like Animal Farm. We start perpetuating the very things we're trying to fight. And we can't do that if we really want an inclusive movement and actual change.
Leslie, you smiled at that question too. I was curious what was going on.
I did for a couple reasons. One, because I work with an amazing organizer named Gabe Bryant here in Philadelphia, and he frequently will not necessarily lead meetings, but he is kind of the one that usually gives marching orders as we start to break out into our breakout groups to start working on media and PR and all these other things that we work in, and not just for the march, but just organizing here generally in Philadelphia. We have a town hall meeting about every 3 or 4 weeks where 500 to 600 people get together and start talking about these things and move the agenda along. So he gives a great speech before he sends everybody out, and he says, I want to make sure that you know that this is an inclusive conversation. And then he asks a second question. Do you know what that means? He says to the group. And you see a lot of people like, yeah, I think I know. He's like, well, what that means is that women should be talking as much as men. What that means is that LGBT members here should be talking as much as anybody else. It means that if you think you're talking too much, it's time to sit down. And it sounds really simple, but that edict that he gives right before everyone goes to have these interactions is incredibly critical and so powerful, and such a message to everybody about the kind of space we're trying to build, and just has that last thought is what's in everyone's mind before they go into these groups where they're going to be self-policing themselves. So I always just encourage when people are doing this work to make sure that you're very clear in what the intention is and how you want your organization or your meeting or whatever you're working on to do is, because you'd be surprised at what a long way it goes just to have that said and not assume that everyone is on the same page as you or your organization. The other thing that I was going to mention was clergy being brought into the conversation, which I think is another spot of intersectionality, because one, obviously clergy's used to always having the mic. It's their job. It's what they're there to do, which is to get the message out. And it can be a bit of a sticking point when you're dealing, especially with young people who may not have a specific connection, not just to a specific church, but to clergy and to church in general. And there's a group here called Power in Philadelphia that has done some really amazing work in terms of building a true coalition with young people and different organizations that are filled with young people. And unbeknownst to me, hindsight's always 20/20, but when I look back at how they went about doing this, I don't know if you could script it any better, and I know it was a very deliberate thing on their part. The first thing they did was they hired someone who is already in the community, had been working in a lot of these organizations previously, to not necessarily act as a liaison, but to be someone who's their expert in that area within their organization. From there, they started coming to all of our meetings, all of our town hall meetings. They came to our actions. They just decided that they were going to be there, and people were going to know who they were and understand what we were about and see what was going on. The third thing they did was the group Power, the clergy groups, planned a very large-scale and very public die-in outside of the Philadelphia Eagles Stadium after our final home game of the season. And it got a lot of publicity.
Wow, that's some energy going on.
Yeah, it got a lot of publicity. It was a really big action on their part. There was a lot of hateful things said at them. I mean, it was a really cantankerous situation. But to us as younger people and to us, the other people in these organizations, it was like, okay, it was a signal that these clergy understood what we were trying to do. They were in alignment with the kind of tactics that we were okay doing, and were ready to come to the table and decide to discuss things together. And without those previous steps, our march never would have happened, because it would have been a false ask on their part to bring people to the table. So I like to highlight it, because it was a lot of little things that allowed the trust to build. And that really is what I encourage any group that is not necessarily already in contact with the youth of their area to do. Get yourself involved with what they're doing, take their lead, show through your own actions that you're willing to do the same things that they're doing, and then you'll see that they're able to come to the table and talk to you, because it's a genuine relationship that has been built. It's a really great model, and it's a really great way to do that. And I think I made a note. What else did I make a note about? Sorry, intersectionality.
Okay.
I didn't talk about. Just that deliberate push to make sure that happens.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So just a note to say, we're a little more than halfway through the hour. You're watching The View. We're talking about Black Lives Matter, and actually I think the larger movement for justice around racism, and because I don't know, Leslie and Kenny, Black Lives Matter to me is a specific group of people organizing in a specific way. Was that one of the sponsoring groups of the march? Is that not a hashtag or language that is solidified where you are? Is that, I mean, I know Black Lives Matter is active in a whole lot of places, but I don't actually know about your areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely active here. Obviously, you can't control what everyone says all the time, but that certainly is the timber of both the march and the movement here in Philadelphia, for lots of reasons. But for me, tantamount is that when Black Lives Matter, then all lives truly do matter. So to me, it's just a call that when Black people in this country do better, everybody in this country does better. So it's a really easy way of getting across the fact that we want to fight for equality for everyone. And we start with those who aren't receiving it at all to help lift up everybody at the same time. So I'm a big proponent of ensuring that is not just the center of all the work that is done. And I also like to say that I'm a very big proponent of my speech that I gave on MLK Day, spoke to this, is that Ferguson itself is really at the heart of this entire movement that's going on, whatever you want to call it, for lots of different reasons, but because they really were the catalyst for waking up a lot of activists and people in this country to know that we can fight for what's right, we can fight for rights that we are due, and we didn't know we were waiting for them, but without them none of us would be here talking about this panel right now. And so I always like to make sure that we centered on them. And the second reason is because, to be perfectly honest, things in St. Louis and Ferguson are continuing to be horrible, continuing to be deplorable towards peaceful protesters, continuing to be assaulting the citizens of that.
Many more murders.
Just last night, was a horrible incident with Jeff Ruda assaulting a woman in the middle of a city council meeting. So the situation there, it's not as though it's been like a check mark. Okay, now we can not talk about that anymore. And I like to always make sure that we're going back there, because
thank you for that.
Black lives being matter lifts everybody. Ferguson being better helps everybody as well. So I always like to mention that as well.
Kenny,
and so we were talking about allyship, and at the Marade, the March Plus Parade, I'll clarify again, is with 35,000 people, and the group I'm marching with is right at the front, and a Black Lives Matter chant breaks out, and some of the people watching the parade go by start coming up to us and shouting at us, "All lives matter!" And these two white members of our group just immediately leave the chant, leave the procession, and go talk to them. It looked like for several minutes, and that's yes, all lives do matter, but chanting at a mostly Black group, all lives matter, stops. That isn't doing what they think it's doing, and that was just an example of allyship that I wanted to lift up, that because I didn't have the energy to do that, we just chanted louder, and but they reported later that several members of the group that they talked to were like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way. And some of them didn't get it, but that's always going to be the way it is. And I just think it's so important for people to use their platform to, whatever it is, to help the Black Lives Matter movement along. And it's so crucial.
I think that all lives matter thing is something that Unitarian Universalists are particularly susceptible to, given our universalism. That for decades we've understood the struggle as being pointing out how everybody is underneath everybody is the same. Kind of stressing unity over difference. And so, when I think if you take someone who hasn't been exposed to very much and they see that Black Lives Matter and they hear all lives matter, our theological history makes us tend toward the second. And so it takes some real leadership from Unitarian Universalists who have the platform to make sure that we bring our people along with that sometimes that kind of universalism has a shadow side, which is smoothing out everybody's experience into the same experience and wiping away what's really going on. It's but that's us. That's particularly us.
Yeah, and context is everything. I mean, I think about Keith Ellison, my congressman, and that's basically his campaign mantra. Everybody matters, everybody, and that's universalism, right? And if you can't contextualize, like, what planet are you on? So it's like both and, But it is, I agree, Kenny, I've had people yell it at me like a curse, that I'm like, when did Keith Ellison's beautiful campaign slogan turn into a curse? And so it's just this, the energy of it is so diminishing, and like, how dare you assert particularity. Lena.
Yeah, I think I just had this conversation or a version of it at church actually on Sunday, and one of the things that I mentioned was I think you can really see the insidiousness of racism and white supremacy in that statement, and how it just creeps up into ways that looks like it makes sense and looks like it's, common sense, but you dig a little deeper and it's not. And one of the things I've been telling people is, like, look, you don't go to a funeral for a friend and say, hey, I lost my dad too. Can we actually just talk about that right now, because that's what this is about? And when I put it in that context, people really, I'm very direct and can be very blunt. I'm like, that's actually what we're saying right now, because if you say all lives matter, because we're talking about people who have died and changing laws for them. And so, it's, and this lady at church, she was like, she was actually really responsive to it and was like, I hadn't really thought about it like that. And I was like, yeah, and like Alicia Garza says, like, when Black people get free, everybody gets free, in the U.S. at least. And so I like to quote that. And so I think it is a particularly UU thing that I'm like, really, come on.
Yeah, and I use that one, and I use another one where I say, do you go to a walk for muscular dystrophy and scream about cancer's going on too? You don't do that, because we're focused on something right now, and it's okay to focus on that thing. We're not curing all the ails of the world. We're discussing this one ail of the world, which is very true. And also for UUs in particular, I do like to pull in the LGBT portion, because it's very easy for UUs to step aside from that universalist stance when it comes to LGBT rights and say, hey, this is something that is something we need to discuss, and yes, we're all good underneath, but these rights are important. And so I try to also put it in that context to say this is a similar fight, and if you're okay and understand why we needed to stand up for marriage equality, why we needed to stand up for discrimination against LGBT UUs and people in general, you should be able to understand what this is. But it also,
you know what, Leslie, that makes me think. I was the head of the GLBT stuff in the early '90s at the UUA, and this is exactly what they were saying then. If we welcome gay people, people will think we're a gay church. We welcome all people. It was I never thought of it till you said that. They say exactly the same thing and had to learn, like, yeah, but look at culturally why churches would specially welcome. So it's the same learning process. So actually, that's a great analogy. Thank you for that. I'd forgotten that history, because really that was the reason people didn't want to be a welcoming congregation, because if they welcomed GLBT people, it would imply that they didn't welcome everybody.
Right.
So it's exactly the same kind of
Well, that's a learning experience that we can go back to and say, hey, we've been through this before. We figured it out. Now we're faced with the same situation. We can go back to what we've learned before, and which is.
I also wanted to just mention about allyship. One thing that I've been really encouraging, those of you who don't know, my husband, Drew, if you're on Twitter, he's @VeryWhiteGuy. He's been a very big proponent of just dismantling white supremacy and talking specifically to white people about white supremacy and the Black Lives Matter movement and what it means to be an ally and what it means to do this work. He actually has a podcast, White Privilege Podcast. It's very good. And one of the things that I've been talking to him about and some of the other people that he works with is that for me as a Black activist, what I would like to see from white people and white communities in general is to take this fight into spaces that Black people do not have access to. There was an action that happened in the Supreme Court last week where I think it was 4 individuals just stood up and had a protested moment, and then they were shuffled out, and then one by one they were each escorted out. And I said to Drew, this is a great action, but it's not one that a Black person necessarily would be able to conduct. One, not every Black person is going to have access to that room, so that's the first thing. And secondly, the consequences for a Black person are going to be very different in that scenario of them just standing up in the middle of the Supreme Court with all the justices there to make this declaration. And obviously this is an extreme example, but what I would challenge allies to do is to really start thinking about spaces in which when you look around, there's no Black people there, little to no, and what would you as an ally be able to do in that space to bring home the message of Black Lives Matters? What would you be able to do to push the envelope in that space as a white person to other white people to show the things that they may not be seeing? A lot of emphasis has been put on allies, what they should or shouldn't do at actions that are led by people of color, which I think is great, and I understand the need for all of those discussions to happen. It's really critical because they can really diminish the impact of these actions. However, there's a lot more of you than there are of us. So given that fact, I think that we need to move to a phase in the movement, especially in this year, where I think awareness of the movement has really reached critical mass. I don't think there's a person in the country at this point that doesn't at least know something's going on, know that things are happening. And so now that we're at this point of almost critical just general knowledge of the movement, where can white allies move into action and really move things forward in a way that in conjunction with Black people they wouldn't be able to? So I just like to put that challenge out. I really encourage people to think outside the box, and when you see yourself in Panera and there's no Black people in Panera, what could you do there? When you see yourself at the local zoo, when you look around and it's all white families there, what could you and your family be doing? So this is where I really like to make that challenge, because I think it's really going to help push this message to the next level and not have this general narrative, oh, it's just those Black people, it's just those liberals, it's just this, it's just that. We need to reach a critical mass where everybody has this uncomfortable moment, even if it's 1 minute in their day or 1 minute in their month, that we're putting this uncomfortable situation out in the open and making it known. And I really think that white allies can play a big role in doing that.
One of the things. Great challenge. Go ahead, Hank.
One of the things I preached about here in Boston on Reverend King's actual birthday, there were a number of folks who blocked off the highway going into Boston one morning, and people were complaining about it. Everybody was complaining about it. they're late for work. Oh, there's maybe somebody in is supposedly an ambulance that couldn't get through. Well, real things, real concerns that people had. And one of them happened. One of these blockades happened in the town where I serve, in Milton, on the highway. And I know that people here in our church too were upset about it, and that, I mean, one of the things I kept hearing from lots of people was, there must be a better way for them to express, I'm in solidarity with them, but must be a better way to express it. And so my children's story that Sunday was the story that Jesus tells of the farmer with two sons who asked the first one to go out and pick fruit, and the son says no at first, and then but then feels bad and goes and does it, and he asks the second son, will you come pick fruit? And the second son says yes, but doesn't, and I asked the kids, what's better, like the son who said no but who did it, or the son who said no? And they said, of course, the son who did the work. And I said, right, actions are more important than language. And I said, as much as we may be upset about traffic, about all these other concerns, what have you done? You've talked, but you haven't done anything. So I think it's a good way for us to challenge folks in our community about the way we think about these subjects, how we think about what our role is and what we can do. But I also think that of course, being part of a larger movement too, and not just doing it on ourselves, which is another thing that UUs love to do ourselves. We think that no one else has done this, so that we come in and go, oh, I have an idea. We'd like to help, and by that we mean we'd like to help you people because we're smarter than you, or whatever it is. It's just, it comes off that way. Whether it's true or not, it comes off that way.
One of the things that I love, Margaret Beard, a minister in Florida who has a congregation of basically old white people, just asked them all to wear Black Lives Matter buttons all week, and to notice the places where they were afraid, the places where somebody responded positively or negatively, and then the next week they reflected on that. And I thought, that's so simple, but that's so powerful. Just to, because, I know, I'll say this, I've thought about putting a bumper sticker on my car, and I go, oh God, what would the police do to me? And that's like, that's me. Like, I've got a lot of privilege in that Prius, you know what I mean? But the fact that the fear comes up for me, so it's, I think, really important to just give little teaching ways for white people to even touch the level of fear that is optional for us. And I thought Margaret's story was a really inspiring way. And Tom, you were going to mention something too.
Well, just on pushing into places where white folks are, is that Emerson Chapel, led by Reverend Krista Taves out in the western suburbs of St. Louis, they have just done, I think, their 20th vigil in a row on Saturday out at a shopping center at Chesterfield, and I forget the other highway. I went out there and did it with them one Saturday, and they're in deep in the suburbs, and they're standing on the side of the road, and people are yelling all kinds of stuff at them, and they're getting all kinds of expressions of solidarity from people, and they're really in the midst of it. And I think they're getting great bravery. Anybody who's listening to this show can write a letter to them, because they're got pushback coming from within their congregation. Write a letter and say to them, saying how important what they're doing is, and that you're behind them even though you're not in their community, and that Unitarian Universalists, I think it's really important for people to know that their co-religionists are proud of them. I think that helps them. If they got letters saying, I'm in Ann Arbor and I'm proud of you, I think everybody likes that, right? Everybody likes that. I think that idea of wearing the Black Lives Matter buttons, I've been thinking about, I've been talking with our Challenging Racism group at the Ann Arbor Church, and, we happen to have a building that is not a banner type building, given its location. And so, what should we do to get our folks to step out there, and to ask folks to wear a Black Lives Matter button for a week, and report back.
And a chance to talk about it. Yeah.
Talk about it could be a great way to push into our congregation is made up of, people who probably on the, are supportive in a distant sort of way. But they think that's also, well, if we lived in Detroit, then we'd do something. But yeah, here,
So we're coming to the end of our hour. Kenny, Lena, and Leslie, I want to give you last words here. Kenny, anything you'd like to say to the listeners about anything?
About it.
For a big question.
Yeah, I do, Meg, and that is that I want to lift up. I think that the faith is making a lot of progress on this, and I simultaneously, want to lift up something that was touched on earlier in the conversation, which is that racism isn't something as Unitarian Universalists that's out there. That's like other people's problem. That it is within us. And so, some conversations in Denver have been about, well, I don't know how to help because, like Tom just mentioned, I'm in the suburbs. I don't know, that's a Detroit problem. That's a Denver problem. Out here we're just people. And like as soon as we get away, the sooner we continue the progress we've made in getting away from that savior mentality and instead looking within, I think the better off we're going to be. So that's my closing argument.
Thank you so much for that, Lena.
Yeah, I think a big ditto. And just to say that, we really need everyone in this work. I think we're at a moment in time where we're turning a moment into a movement, and the more that people can find ways to connect and plug in and be a part of that movement, the more powerful it will be. I noticed Leslie mentioned that they're engaging with the 15 Now campaign, which we are too in Minneapolis. We're going to start organizing with them as well, and so it really is a powerful time. And so just plug in and constantly be searching your own heart for those for where racism is, and I know that's part of the work. So
thanks. Leslie.
My final thought would be actually just two quick anecdotes that came out of the MLK Dare march, which was what our march was called. And it just illustrates how allies can offer themselves in some unique ways. So the first was my email. I was running the email address for the march, and I got an email from a white gentleman named Corey. He's a graphic designer, and he said, "Hey, I saw all this stuff about your march. I thought it looked really great. I don't think I'm going to be able to go, but I made this image because I was really inspired by what you're trying to do." And the image ended up being the one that we used on all of our posters and messaging and everything. So he acted upon himself. It's a beautiful image of the Liberty Bell with doves kind of creating it and then flying off of it. It's really, really great. But from his perspective, that's what he was able to give at that moment. And so we all have talents that we can either give or offer that don't really require leadership or usurping of anything, just requires making it available. The second thing was the night before our event, I got a call from a lawyer in Center City here in Philadelphia, and he said, "Hey, I got your number from my brother who has been going to the meetings, and I'm a lawyer and I really can't put myself out there in any public way, but my office is on the 15th floor on Market Street, and it has a really great view of the biggest part of where the march is going to go, and I would be really honored and happy if you wanted to have any videographers and photographers come here and use our huge bay windows to take images and video of the march from there." Which I was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds great." Of course, it's the night before the march, so now I'm scrambling to find videographers and everybody to go, and it was great. I found 3 people who really wanted to do it, and they went there. He was there with them all day and just let them use the space. And it was a really small gesture on his part. To him, he was going to be working anyways, and who cares? But it was something he thought we might be able to use, and we didn't just use it, but use it for really great effect, because there's been multiple reports on the number of people that attended the march. The police say, 1,500 to 2,000. In reality, it was 7,000. And the footage that this gentleman was able to make possible allowed us to refute the number of people, because it showed very clearly by the way the march was moving and how many people were in each section, how many people were there. So yeah. I really just like to challenge people to think outside the box and think about the things that you can do for the movement, and just make yourself available in ways you wouldn't even think of, that can be incredibly useful. And
Amen.
So let's leave with that.
Amen. That's a great ending, those two stories. It's so, I think this, as Linda said, the moment that's become a movement, I think it's just really, to me, I haven't seen a lot of these moments turn into movements in my lifetime, so all systems go, and it's really so wonderful to speak to some of you who have plugged so completely in and are providing leadership. This conversation, I feel like we've just barely touched the top of so many topics, so we'll be back to it. We're not done, but in the meantime, we're done with this hour. Thanks for being here. Others, say goodbye.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.
See you next time. Bye.